In the final days of April 1945, as the Soviet Red Army smashed through the streets of Berlin and the Nazi Empire collapsed into ash and rubble, one man stood in Hitler's underground bunker, knowing more secrets than perhaps anyone else alive. His name was Heinrich Müller, and he was the chief of the Gestapo, the most feared secret police organization the world had ever known. While other Nazi leaders scrambled to escape or prepared to face justice, Müller simply walked out of the bunker on the evening of May 1st and vanished into history. No body was ever confirmed. No grave was ever verified. No trial ever took place. For more than 70 years, the fate of this man, who helped orchestrate the murder of millions, remained one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of World War II. Some believed he escaped to South America. Others whispered that the Soviets had captured him and brought him to Moscow. A few even claimed he was working for American intelligence. Heinrich Müller was born on April 28, 1900, in the city of Munich in the Kingdom of Bavaria, which was then part of the German Empire. He came into a world that seemed stable and ordered, a world where emperors still ruled and the old ways still held firm. His parents were simple Catholic people, not wealthy or powerful, just ordinary folks trying to make their way. His father worked as a rural police official, a man who believed in duty and rules and doing what you were told. Young Heinrich grew up watching his father in uniform, learning early that authority mattered and that the state was something to be served without question. The family was not rich enough to send Heinrich to fancy schools or universities. After finishing his basic schooling, Heinrich did what many boys from families like his did in those days. He learned a trade. He became an apprentice aircraft mechanic, working with his hands, learning how machines worked, how parts fit together, how systems operated. It was detailed work that required patience and precision, and young Müller showed he had both. He was quiet and serious, not the kind of boy who joked around or drew attention to himself. He kept his head down, followed instructions, and did his job well. But then the world exploded into chaos. In 1914, when Heinrich was only 14 years old, the First World War began. Europe tore itself apart in trenches and mud and blood.
For 4 long years, millions of men died in battles that stretched across the continent. During the final year of World War I, Heinrich Müller served in the German Air Force, known as the Luftstreitkräfte. He became a pilot for an artillery spotting unit, flying dangerous missions over enemy lines to help direct German artillery fire. These were not the glamorous dogfights of fighter races. This was grim, deadly work, where pilots flew slow observation planes that were easy targets for enemy guns. But Müller performed his duties with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything he did. He showed no fear, or at least he never let fear stop him from completing his missions. His superiors noticed his bravery and his dedication. They decorated him several times for his courage under fire. He received the Iron Cross First Class and Second Class, the Bavarian Military Merit Cross Second Class with Swords, and the Bavarian Pilot's Badge. These were not small honors. But the war ended in disaster for Germany. The empire collapsed. The Kaiser fled to Holland. Revolution swept through German cities as soldiers and workers rose up demanding change. Müller returned home to a country he barely recognized, a country defeated and humiliated, forced to sign a harsh peace treaty at Versailles. Like many German soldiers, he felt betrayed. They had fought so hard, suffered so much, and now their country was broken and blamed for everything. In 1919, Müller joined the Bavarian police as an auxiliary worker. He was only 19 years old, but he already knew what he wanted. He wanted order. He wanted authority. He wanted to fight against the chaos that he saw threatening to destroy Germany. And there was plenty of chaos to fight. Communist revolutionaries had taken over Munich for a brief time, creating something called the Bavarian Soviet Republic. During the years of the Weimar Republic, the fragile democracy that governed Germany between the wars, Heinrich Müller worked his way up through the Munich police force with remarkable speed. He was smart and hardworking, the kind of man who never took vacations and who could be reached at his desk any time of day or night, even on Sundays and holidays. His specialty became political police work, tracking and investigating enemies of the state. In those turbulent years, that meant primarily watching communist groups and left-wing organizations.
Müller became an expert on communist activities, building files and networks of informants, learning how to infiltrate underground movements and crush them before they could grow dangerous. His superiors noticed his dedication and his results, but there was something interesting about Heinrich Müller that made him different from many of the Nazis who would later surround him. He was not a believer in National Socialism. In fact, during the Weimar period, he supported the Bavarian People's Party, a conservative Catholic party that had nothing to do with Hitler's movement. When the Nazis tried to seize power in Munich on March 9, 1933, Müller actually advocated using force against them. He wanted the police to crush the Nazi takeover and protect the legitimate government. To him, it did not matter what the politics were. His job was to maintain order and support the existing state, whoever controlled it. Some Nazi leaders never forgot this. They called him an opponent of the movement, someone who had once referred to Hitler as an immigrant unemployed house painter and an Austrian draft dodger. But one man did understand, and that man was Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was young and brilliant and absolutely ruthless, and when he became head of the Bavarian police and later of the security service, he saw in Müller exactly what he needed. Heydrich did not care about Müller's political views or his past opposition to the Nazis. What he cared about was ability, and Müller had ability in abundance. Heydrich knew that Müller was a professional policeman who would serve the state with total dedication regardless of what form that state took. He knew that Müller's expertise in fighting communists was invaluable, and he knew that Müller's lack of strong Nazi party connections meant he would be dependent on Heydrich's patronage, making him loyal and controllable. So Heydrich recruited Müller in 1933, bringing him into the security service along with other skilled policemen. People who met Heinrich Müller often struggled to describe him afterward. He was not a dramatic figure like some Nazi leaders. He did not give fiery speeches or wear elaborate uniforms covered in medals. He was a small man with piercing grey-blue eyes and thin lips, dapper in appearance, but utterly forgettable in person.
One German general who interviewed with him said Müller was the unobtrusive type of police official who leaves no personal impression on the memory, except for those cold eyes that fixed on you with unwavering scrutiny. American journalist William Shirer called him a cold, dispassionate killer. British author Edward Crankshaw described him as the archetype non-political functionary who was in love with personal power and dedicated to the service of authority and the state. Müller was not an intellectual. In fact, he despised intellectuals. He once told a colleague that intellectuals should be sent down a coal mine and blown up. What he loved was administration, the world of notes and memos and regulations and reports. He would sit at his desk transforming Gestapo reports about torture and executions and arrests into administrative paperwork, filing everything neatly away. He did not seem to take pleasure in cruelty or violence. He simply saw it as part of his job, things that needed to be done to serve the state he had sworn to protect. Historians have debated whether Müller truly believed in Nazi ideology or whether he was just an ambitious bureaucrat who served whatever regime was in power. The evidence suggests he was mostly the latter. He did not join the Nazi Party until 1939, and only did so then because Himmler insisted it would help his career. Yet calling Müller apolitical is not quite accurate either. He did have political views, just not ones that fit neatly into Nazi ideology. Walter Schellenberg, an SS intelligence officer, claimed that Müller once praised the Stalinist system as superior to Nazism, saying Stalin did things better than Hitler because Stalin never compromised. Müller was known for admiring Soviet police methods. What he really believed in was not any particular political system, but in the idea of a strong state that could impose total order and control. Whether that state was Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia did not matter to him nearly as much as whether it was powerful and efficient. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II began, the Nazi police and security organizations were reorganized into a new structure called the Reich Security Main Office, known by its German initials as the RSHA. Heinrich Müller became the chief of Department 4 of this organization, which was the Gestapo.
He was now in command of the secret state police for all of Nazi Germany, responsible for hunting down anyone considered an enemy of the regime. To distinguish him from another SS general who was also named Heinrich Müller, people started calling him Gestapo Müller, and that name stuck. Under his leadership, the Gestapo became the most efficient and terrifying secret police force in Europe. Müller succeeded in infiltrating and largely destroying underground resistance networks, particularly those organized by communists and social democrats who opposed Nazi rule. His expertise in fighting communists, built up over years in the Munich police, now served the Nazi state with devastating effect.
But Mueller's role went far beyond simply catching political opponents. He became deeply involved in the crimes that would make the Nazi regime infamous forever. In November 1938, during the Night of Broken Glass, known as Kristallnacht, when Nazi mobs destroyed Jewish shops and synagogues across Germany, it was Mueller who ordered the arrest of between 20,000 and 30,000 Jewish men. In 1939, Hitler and his generals wanted a pretext to invade Poland. Mueller helped mastermind a false flag operation where condemned prisoners from concentration camps were dressed in Polish uniforms. Mueller told these men they would be pardoned and released if they participated. Instead, they were given lethal injections and shot to make it look like they had been killed during a fake Polish attack on a German radio station. This staged incident was then used in Nazi propaganda to justify the invasion of Poland, which began World War II. As the war expanded, so did Mueller's responsibilities and his crimes. He worked closely with Adolf Eichmann, who headed the Gestapo's Office of Jewish Affairs and reported directly to Mueller. In October 1939, Mueller ordered Eichmann to prepare for the deportation of 70,000 to 80,000 Jews from areas Germany had annexed. In October 1941, he issued a directive prohibiting any future Jewish emigration from German-controlled territory, effectively trapping millions of Jews who would soon be murdered. When the Einsatzgruppen death squads began massacring Jews in the Soviet Union in 1941, killing over 1 million people by shooting them into mass graves, Mueller received detailed reports about these murders. He sent these reports to Hitler. On January 20, 1942, Heinrich Mueller attended a meeting at a villa by a lake called Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin. This meeting would become known as the Wannsee Conference, and it was where senior Nazi officials coordinated their plans for what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the meeting and briefed the attendees on the plan to systematically murder every Jew in Europe. Adolf Eichmann took the minutes, and Heinrich Mueller sat there listening, his cold eyes taking in every detail.
After the formal conference ended, Mueller, Heydrich, and Eichmann remained behind for informal discussions, reportedly enjoying glasses of cognac while they talked about the logistics of genocide. By this point, Mueller knew everything. Eichmann had reported to him months earlier that Himmler had told him Hitler had ordered the physical destruction of the Jews. In the months and years that followed, Mueller played a central role in organizing the Holocaust. Eichmann later testified that he remained in constant contact with Mueller throughout the war, reporting to him about deportations and killings. Mueller reserved certain powers for himself. When deportation reports came in, it was Mueller who wrote the final numbers in his distinctive orange-colored pencil at the top of each document. He sent Eichmann to visit extermination sites and report back with details. When Eichmann returned from visiting Chelmno, where Jews were being murdered in gas vans, he told Mueller the scene was horrible, an indescribable inferno. Mueller showed no emotion. It was just information to be filed away. When reports of the mass murders began appearing in Allied newspapers in the autumn of 1942, Himmler instructed Mueller to ensure that all the bodies were buried or burned to destroy evidence. Mueller also enforced the Nazi racial policies in other areas. He sent instructions to all Gestapo offices about how to handle cases where German women became pregnant by Polish forced laborers. If both parties were deemed racially acceptable and the Polish man wanted to marry the woman, the relationship could continue after the Pole underwent Germanization. But if either party was deemed racially unfit, the Polish man would receive what the Nazis called special treatment, which was a euphemism for execution. Mueller signed these orders without hesitation, condemning men to death based on photographs and racial classifications. In May 1942, Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in Prague by Czechoslovak soldiers who had been sent from London by the government in exile. Mueller was immediately sent to Prague to head the investigation. He used a combination of bribery, torture, and relentless detective work to track down the assassins. When he finally located them hiding in a church, they killed themselves rather than be captured alive. Mueller had succeeded in his mission, but he had lost something irreplaceable.
Heydrich had been his patron, the man who protected him from other Nazis who resented his past and distrusted his lack of ideological commitment. With Heydrich dead, Mueller's position became more complicated. Eventually, Ernst Kaltenbrunner took over as Mueller's superior, but Mueller never had the same relationship with Kaltenbrunner that he had enjoyed with Heydrich. Mueller's work continued with the same cold efficiency. In 1943, he was sent to Rome to pressure Fascist Italy to hand over their Jews for deportation. Despite having some support from Mussolini, Mueller largely failed in this mission because influential Jewish figures in Italy successfully appealed to Italian police and military officers on religious grounds, convincing them to resist Nazi pressure. Also in 1943,
Müller gathered firm evidence that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, was involved with resistance movements plotting against Hitler. But when Müller presented this evidence to Himmler, Himmler told him to drop the case. This offended Müller deeply. To him, enemies of the state should be arrested regardless of their position or connections. After the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, Müller finally got his chance to destroy the resistance networks he had been tracking. He was placed in charge of arrests and interrogations for everyone suspected of involvement in the plot. Over 5,000 people were arrested. About 200 were executed, including Wilhelm Canaris. Müller reportedly declared afterward that they would not make the same mistake as in 1918, that they would not leave their internal German enemies alive. Even as Germany's military situation became desperate, Müller remained confident of victory, or at least claimed to be. In December 1944, he told one of his officers that the Ardennes offensive would result in the recapture of Paris. By April 1945, the war was clearly lost. Soviet forces were fighting their way into Berlin street by street. American and British armies were advancing from the west. The Nazi empire that had once stretched from France to the Soviet Union was collapsing. But Heinrich Müller remained at his post in Berlin as the Gestapo chief. He was among the Nazi loyalists who gathered in Hitler's underground bunker, known as the Führerbunker, as the end approached.
One of his final tasks was interrogating Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's SS liaison officer, after it was discovered that Himmler had attempted secret peace negotiations with the Western Allies. Fegelein was arrested in the cellar of the Trinity. Hitler expelled Himmler from all his posts and ordered Fegelein shot. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, saw Müller in the bunker on April 22nd. She noted that Müller had apparently taken over Kaltenbrunner's duties as head of the entire Reich Security main office, making him even more powerful in those final days. Both Junge and the bunker's telephone operator, Rokas Misch, recalled seeing Müller on April 30th, the day Hitler committed suicide. The atmosphere in the bunker was one of complete despair. Hitler was dead. The Reich was finished. Soviet soldiers were fighting just blocks away. Everyone knew that capture meant either execution or years in a Soviet prison camp. On the evening of May 1, 1945, Heinrich Müller was last seen in the Führerbunker. Hitler's pilot, Hans Bauer, later quoted Müller as saying that he knew Russian methods exactly and had not the faintest intention of being taken prisoner by the Russians. Then Müller walked out of the bunker. What happened to Heinrich Müller after he left the bunker remains one of the greatest mysteries of World War II. Unlike other top Nazi leaders whose fates were clear, Müller simply disappeared without a trace. No confirmed body was ever found. No reliable witness ever reported seeing him after May 1st. No documents in any archive have definitively established what became of him. For decades, intelligence services, Nazi hunters, and historians searched for answers, but found only contradictions and dead ends. The very fact that Müller vanished so completely only added to the fear and mystery that surrounded him. He had been the chief of the Gestapo, the man who knew all the secrets, who had files on everyone, who had orchestrated arrests and interrogations and executions across all of occupied Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the American Office of Strategic Services, which later became the CIA, launched an extensive search for Müller. The search was complicated by the fact that Heinrich Müller is an extremely common German name, like John Smith in English. To make matters worse, there were two different SS generals named Heinrich Müller, and Gestapo Müller did not appear to have a middle name that could help distinguish him from others with the same name. American and British agents searched the home of Müller's wartime mistress, Anna Schmid, in 1947, but found nothing suggesting he was alive. They placed his wife Sophie and his former secretary under surveillance in case he tried to contact them. They investigated reports from people who claimed to have seen him or buried him. The CIA files released in 2001 show that American intelligence was never in contact with Müller after the war, despite conspiracy theories suggesting otherwise. The Royal Air Force also wanted to find Müller because he was believed responsible for the murder of Allied airmen who had escaped from Stalag Luft III prison camp. But as the Cold War intensified and American priorities shifted to confronting the Soviet Union, interest in hunting missing Nazis declined. The general assumption became that Müller was probably dead, killed during the chaotic final days of the Battle of Berlin. But without a confirmed body or death certificate, nobody could be certain. And that uncertainty created space for wild theories and stories that would persist for generations. In the years and decades after the war,
Numerous theories emerged about what had happened to Heinrich Müller. One of the most persistent was that he had been captured by the Soviets and taken to Moscow. Walter Schellenberg, the SS intelligence officer who had known Müller during the war, claimed in his memoir that Müller had defected to the Soviet Union in 1945. He said a German officer who had been a prisoner of war in the USSR had supposedly seen Müller in Moscow in 1948 and that Müller had died shortly afterward. But Schellenberg provided no details about who this German officer was or any way to verify the story. In 1961, a Polish intelligence officer who defected to the United States claimed he had heard from Soviet superiors that sometime between 1950 and 1952, the Soviets had picked up Müller and taken him to Moscow. The theory that Müller worked for the Soviets made some sense on the surface. He had openly admired Soviet police methods during the war. He had expertise in intelligence and counterintelligence that would have been valuable to Stalin's security services. And the Soviets certainly did capture and use some Nazi officials after the war. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and archives were open to researchers, no evidence emerged to support the theory that Müller had been in Soviet hands. Another theory held that Müller had escaped to South America, like some other Nazi war criminals, including Adolf Eichmann. But again, there was no evidence. In 1967, there was a bizarre incident in Panama where a man named Francis Willard Keith was accused of being Heinrich Müller. West German prosecutors claimed that Müller's wife Sophie had looked at photographs of Keith and identified him as her missing husband. The Panamanian government was pressured to extradite him for trial. But when Keith's fingerprints were checked, they proved conclusively he was not Müller, and he was released. In 1967, Israeli operatives were caught by West German police attempting to break into the Munich apartment of Müller's wife, presumably hoping to find evidence about his whereabouts. In 2013, a German historian named Johannes Tuchel announced that he believed he had finally solved the mystery of what happened to Heinrich Müller.
Tuchel was the head of the memorial to the German resistance in Berlin, and he had been researching death records and burial documents from the final days of the war. He claimed he had found evidence that Müller's body had been discovered in August 1945 by a work crew that was cleaning up corpses in the ruins of Berlin. According to the documents Tuchel found, the body was that of an SS general with identification papers showing the name Heinrich Müller. The body had initially been buried in a mass grave on the site of a former Jewish cemetery in the Berlin Neck district. The idea that the Gestapo chief who had helped orchestrate the Holocaust might be buried in a Jewish cemetery struck many people as a terrible and offensive irony. Jewish leaders in Germany called it a terrible iniquity. But Tuchel insisted the evidence was solid. He said a death certificate showed that Müller had died near the Luftwaffe headquarters in the final days of the war, likely on May 1, 1945, probably killed either by Soviet artillery or by his own hand. The body had been hastily buried during the chaos of Berlin's fall, then later moved to the mass grave. Tuchel believed this explained why Müller had never been found. However, Tuchel's claims remained controversial. The evidence he presented, while suggestive, was not conclusive. No DNA testing was done to confirm the body was actually Müller's. The identification had been based on papers found on a corpse, but in the chaos of Berlin's fall, papers could easily have been switched or misidentified. The site of the mass grave had been in East Berlin during the Cold War, making it impossible for West German authorities to investigate when they were actively searching for Müller in the 1960s. After German reunification, no attempt was made to excavate the site, partly because it would mean disturbing the graves of thousands of people, and partly because Jewish community leaders opposed the idea of disturbing what had become consecrated ground. Part of what makes Heinrich Müller's disappearance so fascinating and disturbing is who he was and what he knew. This was not some minor official who slipped away in the confusion of war's end. This was the head of the Gestapo, the man who had files on everyone, who knew every secret of the Nazi regime, who had personally coordinated the Holocaust and countless other crimes.
He knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. He knew which industrialists had collaborated with the regime. He knew which foreign officials had worked with the Nazis. He knew details about resistance networks, spy rings, and secret operations. This is why conspiracy theories about Müller persist even today. Some people cannot accept that a man who knew so much could simply die anonymously in a mass grave. They believe someone must have wanted him, either to use his knowledge or to ensure his silence. The theory that the Soviets captured him makes sense from this perspective. Stalin's intelligence services would have valued someone with Müller's expertise and information. The theory that American intelligence might have used him, though debunked by CIA files, also arose from this same logic. But the most likely explanation, the one that most historians accept, is far less dramatic. What we do know for certain is that Mueller left behind a wife and children. He had married Sophie Dishner in July 1924 when he was 24 years old. They had at least 3 children together, including a son named Reinhard and a daughter named Elizabeth. Sophie lived until 1990, surviving her husband by decades if he truly died in 1945. She never remarried. She never publicly spoke much about her husband or what she knew about his fate. When Israeli agents tried to break into her apartment in 1967, they were hoping she might have hidden documents or information about where Mueller had gone. But if Sophie knew anything, she took those secrets to her grave. Heinrich Mueller remains the highest-ranking member of the Nazi government whose fate has never been definitively established. While Hitler's suicide is confirmed, while Himmler's death by cyanide is documented, while Göring's execution was carried out after the Nuremberg trials, Mueller simply vanished into the fog of history. This makes him unique among the Nazi leadership, a ghost who haunts the historical record. He was never tried for his crimes. He never faced his victims or their families. He never had to answer for the millions who died because of orders he gave and systems he created. The crimes for which Mueller would have been responsible are staggering in their scale and horror.
As the operational head of the Gestapo from 1939 to 1945, he oversaw the arrest, torture, and murder of countless political prisoners, resistance fighters, and ordinary people who opposed or simply failed to comply with Nazi rule. He played a central role in organizing the Holocaust, attending the Wannsee Conference, coordinating with Adolf Eichmann on deportations, receiving reports from death squads, and ensuring the machinery of genocide ran smoothly and efficiently. He was responsible for the murder of Allied prisoners of war. He helped create the false flag operation that provided the pretext for starting World War II. He orchestrated the arrest and execution of thousands of people after the July 20th plot against Hitler. Yet to the end, Mueller seems to have felt no remorse. Everyone who knew him described him as cold and emotionless, a man who transformed reports of unimaginable suffering into administrative paperwork without showing any human feeling. He was what the historian Edward Crankshaw called a non-political functionary, someone in love with power and dedicated to serving authority for its own sake, regardless of what that authority commanded. This makes Mueller in some ways more frightening than the ideological Nazis who believed in their racist theories and their vision of a new world order. Mueller believed in nothing except duty and the state. He would have served any regime with the same efficiency and the same lack of moral hesitation. Today, more than 70 years after Heinrich Mueller walked out of Hitler's bunker and disappeared, we still do not know with absolute certainty what became of him. The most likely explanation is that he died in Berlin in early May 1945, probably killed by Soviet artillery or possibly by his own hand, and that his body was buried in a mass grave that has never been positively identified. The evidence that historian Johannes Tuchel presented in 2013 supports this conclusion, though it does not prove it beyond all doubt. But the fact that we cannot be completely certain, that there is still that small shadow of doubt, keeps the mystery alive. It is one of the last great unsolved puzzles of World War II. Mueller's disappearance has inspired books and documentaries and endless speculation. It has become part of the mythology of the Nazi era, a reminder that not every story from that terrible time has a clear ending.
The uncertainty about his fate also means that Mueller escaped one thing that other Nazi leaders did not. He was never forced to sit in a courtroom and hear the evidence of his crimes read aloud. He was never forced to see the survivors who could testify to what he had done. He was never forced to face the judgment of history while still alive. The search for Mueller also reveals something about the post-war period and the priorities of the major powers. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a genuine effort to find Nazi war criminals and bring them to trial. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the major leaders who could be found. Investigators pursued others across the globe. But as the Cold War began and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified, the urgency of hunting Nazis declined. Both sides became more interested in using former Nazi expertise, whether in intelligence or science or other fields, than in punishing everyone who had served the regime. Some war criminals were recruited to work for their former enemies. Others were quietly allowed to slip away. By the 1950s, the massive effort to find people like Mueller had largely ended.
The story of Heinrich Müller is the story of a man who dedicated his life to serving power without questioning what that power demanded of him. From his teenage years as a decorated pilot in World War I, to his rise through the Munich police, to his position as chief of the Gestapo, Müller followed the same pattern. He served the state, whatever form that state took, with absolute loyalty and ruthless efficiency. He was a workaholic who never took vacations, a bureaucrat who loved order and regulations, a professional who saw torture and mass murder as just another administrative task to be completed. He had no strong political ideology. He was not driven by hatred or fanaticism like some of the Nazis around him. This made him extraordinarily dangerous. A person who commits atrocities because they believe in a twisted ideology might be stopped if you can change their beliefs or defeat their movement. But a person who commits atrocities simply because it is their job, who would do the same thing for any authority that commanded it, represents a threat that can never be completely eliminated as long as human societies have bureaucracies and hierarchies. Müller showed that you do not need to be a true believer to become a mass murderer.
You just need to be willing to follow orders without asking whether those orders are right or wrong. You just need to value efficiency and career advancement more than human life. The mystery of Müller's disappearance adds a final haunting chapter to his story. The man who created fear in millions, who built and ran the machinery of terror that the Gestapo represented, simply vanished into the night and was never found. Whether he died in the ruins of the city he had helped destroy, or whether he lived on somewhere in hiding, he escaped the justice he deserved. The families of his victims never saw him stand trial. The world never heard him answer for his crimes in his own voice. He remains a shadow, a ghost, a question mark at the end of one of history's darkest periods. The fact that we still do not know his final fate, that the mystery endures even now, is perhaps fitting for a man who spent his career operating in shadows, keeping secrets, and hiding the truth. Heinrich Müller walked out of Hitler's bunker on May 1, 1945, and walked into history as the Gestapo chief who vanished after World War II, leaving behind millions of victims and one final unanswered question.